Back in the 1980s, a TV news anchor in Knoxville, Tennessee, began her evening broadcast with this inane statement. Once again, the world's attention is focused on Knoxville. Now, I love East Tennessee as much as the next person who claims a deep devotion to the volunteer state. But come on, man, the world's a mighty big place. I've taken the anchor's comment with me wherever I've traveled and couldn't wait for some stranger to ask me where I was from, so I could see if she knew something about the significance of Knoxville that I didn't. I remember being asked that question by a taxi driver in Glasgow, Scotland. "Where you from?" he asked. "Canada?" "Why, no," I answered with a sheepish grin on my face. "I'm from near Knoxville." I wasn't too surprised when he asked if Knoxville was in the United States. In an attempt to help him appreciate the location of the city, I asked him if he had heard of Daniel Boone and the Wilderness Road. He said, "Yes, I'm a fan of the TV show that starred Fess Parker as Daniel." He went on to say that he was a country music fan and loved the song about the Cumberland Gap. He seemed relieved when I told him that Knoxville was about 50 miles from that historic place. In recalling that encounter, I thought it would be awesome if today on The Vantage Point we could explore the Cumberland Gap and why it's internationally known as America's first gateway to the West. I hope you'll join me. The Cumberland Gap was made famous among Europeans by its historic role in providing a western passage for early pioneers. It sits on the border of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. It's actually a low place in the Cumberland Mountain, which forms the north wall of the Powell Valley. The mountain pass was formed by geological processes over eons of time. Deer, bear, and other animals were forced south by advancing sheets of ice during the last ice age, some 14 to 40,000 years ago. They wore a trail through the pass as they searched for hunting and foraging lands. For similar reasons, during the Little Ice Age, Cherokee and Shawnee hunters and warriors later followed the well-worn path through the mountain. Western European societies were likewise assaulted by the Little Ice Age. Population pressures in Ireland and Great Britain, coupled with political and religious oppression, forced hundreds of thousands of their seed to seek a new and better life in America. A towering outcrop called the Pinnacle has historically provided armies, bandits, and hunters with an excellent vantage point to watch the intermittent flow of animals and people passing through the Cumberland Gap. At 2,440 feet above sea level, the rocky outcrop is 800 feet above the gap. Cumberland Mountain is quite steep, and because of many decades of heavy timber harvesting in the area, the soil became shallower as its denuded slope gave up its precious soil to the forces of gravity and running water. Because early pioneers moving through the gap were easy prey for bandits and vengeful natives, they were keen to clear the mountain of its refuge, providing woody cover. Today, however, the mountain is protected by the United States Park Service. Through changes in local land use patterns and sound conservation measures used by the Park Service, the slopes are once again sheltered by a lush covering of oaks, hickories, and maples. Just north and west of the Cumberland Mountain lies the Pine Mountain. It forms something of a second barrier to the interior of the continent. The extensive, heavily dissected plateau was formed some 245 million years ago as the North American plate collided with an African plate, causing a folding and faulting of the Earth's crust in eastern North America. From the pinnacle above the gap, it's easy to see the result of this collision. The view to the south and east reveals a landscape that resembles a crumpled carpet or gentle waves moving across a mill pond. There are ridges and valleys running in a northeast and southwest direction across the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and the Great Valley of East Tennessee. Before that collision, about 320 million years ago, there was another collision. That time it was between the North American and European plates. This impact forced the North American plate downward below sea level. Much of the area known as southern Appalachia was actually under a shallow ocean. Animals with calcium-rich shells died and fell to the sea floor, and over time their crusty remains formed limestone rock. Other sediments fell to the floor and hardened into shale and sandstone layers. When the most recent plate collision occurred, those pliable rock layers were folded and in some places cracked, creating the beautiful landscape we see today. The pressure and heat resulting from the impact transformed the core of the mountains into dense metamorphic rock. Some scholars have argued that the Cumberland Gap was formed by water flowing over the area during the era of plate tectonics or collisions. Their argument goes like this. As the North American plate buckled under the immense pressure generated by tectonic forces, the Appalachian Mountains rose slowly. They go on to argue that as the uplift occurred, an existing river cut the gap into its present shape. While that's an accurate description of tectonic mountain building, I think there's a better explanation for how the gap formed. No doubt running water has played a role in shaping the gap, as it does all landscapes, but I think that the bulk of the material that once filled the present-day void in the Cumberland Mountain was blown out by the same meteorite that created the bowl-shaped depression that begins less than a mile northwest of the gap. There's little doubt among scholars that the city of Middlesboro, Kentucky, and its population of around 11,000 souls sit in the impressive, nearly 8 square mile impact crater. In addition to its interesting geological history, the Cumberland Gap area is a visually striking place. It's also one of the most significant places in American migration history. But why did the Cumberland Gap become America's first gateway to the West? Early pioneers could have crossed the Cumberland Mountain near Pennington Gap in Virginia, but because Pine Mountain, which parallels the Cumberland Gap to the north, did not offer a low place to traverse it near Pennington Gap. Because of that, settlers were forced to travel 40 miles on to the Cumberland Gap, where an old worn-out trail that we've discussed already stretched northward through a pass in the Pine Mountains some 14 miles away. For westward-oriented settlers, moving beyond the gap was illegal because, with the passage of the Proclamation Act in 1763, the British government had declared those lands off-limit. Nonetheless, and in defiance of the law, Daniel Boone and 38 woodsmen were employed in 1775 by Richard Henderson's Transylvania Company to blaze the Wilderness Road along the ancient trail. Henderson's company had just exchanged 8 wagon loads of goods with the Cherokee for Kentucky, a place that they called Transylvania. The sale took place at Sycamore Shoals, Tennessee. Daniel Boone was in attendance, and the interpreter for the auspicious occasion was a tall, handsome fellow named Joseph Vann. It was he who interpreted Dragging Canoe's description of Kentucky as a dark and bloody ground. They should have asked him why Kentucky was dark and bloody. They would have learned that the Shawnee also claimed the land, and they were blood enemies of the Cherokee. The Cherokee had immigrated to southern Appalachia from the northeast, near the modern-day border with Canada, where other tribes spoke similar Iroquoian languages. The Cherokee came to the region in the middle of the 15th century and established a capital at Shota in what is today Monroe County, Tennessee. The Shawnee, whose name means southern people of the Algonquin, were pushed out of their villages in present-day New York and Pennsylvania by rival Iroquois, allies of the Cherokees, in the 17th century. Like the Cherokee, the Shawnee built small towns on riverbanks and were good at farming low-lying fertile fields. The Cherokee and Shawnee were bloody rivals, and as such, the country north of the Cumberland Gap was disputed territory and was, as described by Dragging Canoe, a dark and bloody ground. The Great Warrior's Path, which ran from the Cherokee capital at Shota, stretched north through the Cumberland Gap, following meandering hollows filled with canes and thorns. The path also crossed rapidly flowing creeks and rivers until reaching the rolling bluegrass area north of the Kentucky River. This region, like its subsequent state name, was Kentucky. Over time, the Cherokee and Shawnee came to use Kentucky primarily as a hunting ground, and it was disputed territory. But most of the Shawnee who had an interest in Kentucky lived in towns located north of the Ohio River in what is today southern Ohio. The Cherokee and migrating herds of buffalo used the relatively low-lying Powell Valley in Tennessee and Virginia as a route to the Gap and into Kentucky. The trail that they helped wear into the landscape extended eastward through the Powell Valley of Virginia to Moccasin Gap near modern-day city of Johnson City, Tennessee. There the trail split off to the north through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. That trail was called the Great Indian Warpath. Later, as whites came into the area, it would be called the Great Wagon Road. Anyway, east through Tennessee to Chota were other paths, and they provided routes across the mountains of western North Carolina all the way to the Piedmont and down to Chota, the capital of the Cherokees. European pioneers and African slaves later used the Wilderness Road to reach the fertile and rolling lands of the interior of Kentucky. Like Daniel Boone himself, many settlers crossed the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to claim lands in Missouri. As Mark Farquharson points out in his seminal book on Boone, in his later years, the adventurer led small hunting parties as far west as Oklahoma. That's a solid resume for a geographer who started his life in Berks County, Pennsylvania, nearly 30 years before the French and Indian War and the passage of the Proclamation Act. I hope you got something out of this snippet of America's migration history. If you liked it, or even if you didn't, I hope you'll leave a comment below. Of course, if you enjoyed the topic, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. If you have some suggestions for future topics, please let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. Hey, I'll see you next time here on The Vantage Point.